Morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Andy Cutchins. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for the National Interest in Washington, D.C., and I am very happy to host our 11th online event in a series of organized by the Central Asian Connectivity Project at the Center in Washington. And our topic today is Central Asian Fighters and Global Jihad. Um, and we have a terrific set of speakers for our discussion today. So let me quickly introduce them, and then we can move right into discussion. Leading off will be Dr. Gavin Helf, who is an adjunct professor at the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies, CERES at Georgetown University. He's worked on the Soviet Union, especially Central Asia, with USAID and the U.S. Institute of Peace. He has taught Russian and Soviet foreign policy, comparative politics, and security studies at Notre Dame, Cornell, Moscow's International University, George Washington University, and has lectured at the National War College, the U.S. Military Academy, the Foreign Service Institute, and the Georgian Foundation for Strategic International Studies, where actually he was just there last week in Tbilisi for their annual conference. Our second speaker will be Dr. Asfandyar Mir, who's a senior fellow now at the Senior Fellow for South Asia at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. Previously, he was a senior expert at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where he focused on South Asia and U.S. counterterrorism policy. His research spans international relations of South Asia, South Asian foreign policies and military strategies, U.S. foreign policy towards South Asia, and U.S. counterterrorism strategy. From 2022 to 2024, he directed a USIP senior study group on U.S. counterterrorism policy in Afghanistan and Pakistan. He's also an adjunct lecturer at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, my alma mater. And thirdly, we will have Dr. Noah Tucker, who is a senior research consultant for the Oxus Society and associate at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard, and a visiting fellow at the Handa Center for the Study of Terrorism, Political Violence at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Noah has worked as a consultant to programs supporting returnees from the Syrian conflict in Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan for the U.S. State Department and the USIP. He has spent more than 6 years living and working in the region, primarily in Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and works in Russian and Uzbek. And he is currently stranded for the moment right now in the Istanbul airport. So we're especially glad that he was able to find a quiet spot and connect with us for this discussion. You might have noticed that all three of our speakers have connections to the U.S. Institute for Peace. And the discussions about this event go back to the late winter, actually, between Gavin and myself. And first of all, about the topic itself, but also our concern really about what was happening to the ecosphere of expertise in Washington on, on a lot of places. The one of first concern for us was Central Asia, Afghanistan, and Eurasia more broadly. So this event is somehow related to what has transpired with USIP and a lot of other research organizations in Washington, D.C. Finally, I want to note that we have a terrific audience tuning into this, and for our audience participation, please put your question or comment, concisely as possible, of course, into the chat function, and we will get to them as soon as possible. But we'll first begin with opening remarks by our three speakers. And Gavin, you're up.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, this really did come from a conversation that we had about where we see in the world Central Asians popping up as foreign fighters. The fact that the story goes back a long way. I think one of my favorite statistics to cite is from the 2017 Sufran Center report, Beyond the Caliphate. And I just love, this is a very interesting statement, right? The country that sent the foreign fighters, according to this report, to the Caliphate and ISIS back in the day was the Soviet Union. If you add up all of the bits and pieces. And a lot of that measure, by large measure, is from Central Asia. So I wanted to talk about sort of what that looked like and how that's changed since the days of the Caliphate. Um, you know, the thing that really surprised us, I think, going back 10, 15 years at the time, and Noah and I were working on this with USAID research back then, was the fact that we had always expected somehow Central Asia to be involved in the Afghanistan problem set, and involved in, you know, terrorism and recruitment going on in the South. But what really surprised us was when they started popping up in the Middle East, and we saw Central Asians in large numbers going to join ISIS and the Caliphate, going to join al-Nusra and other groups in Syria and Iraq, and that was very confusing. A lot of the research that we did looked at the, you know, what we call push factors, or the, you know, what were the underlying reasons that people, the drivers for Central Asia's going, and those sort of narrowed down, I think, over time to a range of things that you might expect. Lack of economic opportunity in some of these post-Soviet, you know, equivalents of Western Pennsylvania, where there was no industry and jobs had all been lost and there was no economic opportunity. We saw, especially in Kyrgyzstan in the south, ethnic problems, ethnic inclusion, Kyrgyz making it hard for Uzbeks to live a normal economic life. And then we started to see lots of those Uzbeks migrate first to Russia and then on to Iraq and Syria. And then the overwhelming sort of numbers of labor migrants that were going from Central Asia to Russia made an available pool. So, you know, lack of economic opportunity, lack of ethnic inclusion, and a large number of labor migrants who were living marginal and unpleasant lives made them very open to recruitment by lots of different groups. Well, here's the thing I think that's really relevant for our conversation today on this, is that none of those things have really changed. You know, ISIS and the Caliphate are gone in Iraq and Syria, but there is still a lack of economic opportunity. There is still problems with ethnic inclusion. There are still a large number of labor migrants who, if anything, are living in worse conditions than they had before. I think what's really interesting is that we, I think throughout this, saw real points of geographic concentration. Of all of those factors that I talked about, economic opportunity, lack of ethnic inclusion, labor migration, there were places where some of those places that fit that profile saw large numbers of foreign fighters go. And then you saw places, you know, right next door, towns and cities with the same profile, where people didn't go to join the Caliphate. Maybe they went to St. Petersburg and became taxi drivers, or maybe they went to construction jobs in Siberia or other things. So a lot of it had to do, I think, with those networks. And I can recall throughout this whole process having this conversation with Noah about networks, the same kinds of networks that brought labor migrants to a certain destination, also brought large numbers of people from the same geographic region to join ISIS and other groups. So we have to, I think, keep a really good eye on where this is happening. It may be different places than we saw before because of different kinds of networks and different kinds of groups trying to attract them. We have a couple of other things going on that we really didn't have at that time. One is the large number of returnees, and I have spent maybe the last 5 years or so, along with Noah, working on the reintegration of the returning ISIS families, women and children primarily, but there are also men and former fighters who have been brought back to Central Asia, who returnees who represent potentially a target group, if not well integrated. Large number of what, for want of a better term, we call releasees, those who were arrested never went to join the Islamic State, but were arrested on extremism charges, particularly under President Karimov in Uzbekistan during his tenure, in Tajikistan, who have been released in large numbers by the thousands and not well reintegrated into their societies, and perhaps radicalized during that experience. We've seen also lots of signs that those push factors and those economic and social and political grievances are still active, because we've seen a lot of movement into other forms of violence that are not necessarily, Islamic terrorism, like organized crime, and flows into organized crime, into violent nationalist extremism, which we've seen across the region, perhaps, impacting things in the region more than Islamic terrorism is organized nationalist violence. We have seen Central Asians popping up on both sides of the conflict in Ukraine. Many of those as labor migrants who were then mobilized because they were dual passport holders, or offered a chance to become Russian citizens, or simply shanghaied into joining the Russian military in large numbers. But we've also seen it on the Ukraine side among labor migrants from Central Asia in Ukraine. So I go back to something, that I remember Noah writing at one point, that, when we talk about Islamist radicalization in Central Asia, what we might actually be seeing is the Islamification of existing radicalism. That radicalism is available, the discontent is available, and it's open to all sorts of other sorts of pull factors, right? So it's really very much depends on who's looking to recruit from these groups. And that could be both within the traditional set of organizations that we'll talk about today, but it could also be, like I said, organizations that are looking to mobilize along nationalist violence lines, looking at organizations that are trying to draw into other conflicts. So in a world that is even recently under even more churn than we've seen before, I think there were ample opportunities for Central Asian fighters to be made available for recruitment by other organizations. And I'll stop there for now and hand off to the others.
Okay, thanks, Gavin. That was a great opening presentation. Let's turn now to Asfandyar, who is going to talk a bit more about what's going on the Afghan side of the border.
Sure. Thank you, Andy, for convening today's conversation. A real pleasure and an honor to be a part of this group. I'm really happy that we're convening this conversation. I think there's so much going on around the world, so many issues, pressing issues, crises, and I think this is one of those important trend lines that, if left unattended, it could certainly become a much bigger issue and create all sorts of problems. So, let me jump right in. I am going to focus myself to how I see the relationship between ISIS-K and Central Asia, and specifically Central Asian fighters. As is now well known, it's well established that ISIS-K has really emerged as the most dangerous terrorist organization, since the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. In some ways, belies our expectations. I think the concern was that a terror group which is more closely aligned with the Taliban would get a bounce from the Taliban's return to power. That didn't happen. Al-Qaeda appears still somewhat subdued. On the other hand, ISIS-K, which is a rival to the Taliban, has emerged and has been engaged in violence both inside Afghanistan, but also beyond Afghanistan, or at least attempts at violence with varying success. And one of the most concerning trends or sub-trends within sort of the broader trend of ISIS-K strength, resurgence, plotting overseas has been the involvement of Central Asian fighters, nationals of Central Asian countries. So let me just throw in a few examples, a few different examples to illustrate this particular issue. So, in January 2024, there was an attack on a church in Santa Monica, which was sort of claimed by, linked to ISIS-K, the organization, and the Turkish authorities very explicitly identified someone of Central Asian origin as being involved. Soon after, there was an attack, a massive attack in Kerman, Iran, on the death anniversary of the IRGC commander, the leader of the Quds Force, Qasem Soleimani, by ISIS-K. And that attack was certainly carried out by ISIS-K, and Iranian authorities were the first ones to report that, again, a Central Asian individual was involved. They identified a Tajik national. But Tajik-focused ISIS-K channels actually went a little further. They said not only was the attacker of the Kerman attack a Tajik, but also the person involved in Turkey in the attack on the Santa Monica church was also a Tajik. Then around the same time, there was a disruption of a terror cell in Germany, that they were attacking multiple strikes at cathedrals in Germany, Austria, and even there we were told of an involvement of a Central Asian origin person. Fast forward to March of 2024, there was a massive attack in Moscow at the Crocus City Hall, and not only were the attackers of that particular attack Central Asians. We have since discovered that maybe even the mastermind, the plotters of that particular incident had Central Asian origins. Then over the last year or so, we have been, by we, I mean the counterterrorism community, has been tracking the presence and maybe some concentration of ISIS-K along the Afghan border, in particular around southeast Afghanistan and southwest Pakistan, where there is a pretty credible suggestion of a significant contingent of Central Asian fighters, maybe even leaders of ISIS-K, mid-level, senior level, of Central Asian origin. So all to say that Central Asian foreign fighters are playing a very important role. Central Asian origin operatives that are in contact with ISIS-K Central Command, Core, if you want to call it that. I think that's an important capability that ISIS-K has come to acquire. You might say that the involvement of Central Asians in ISIS-K activity is not entirely novel, and I guess I agree to that to an extent, because when ISIS first emerged, there was a US-trained Tajik Special Forces officer, Gulmurod Khalimov, and Gavin and Noah can speak to him better than I can. He had defected to ISIS. However, this time around, I think things are more complex than that sort of single defection. And I think what is different this time is that all this involvement of Central Asians is coinciding with very strong, focused ISIS-K propaganda and messaging, targeting Central Asians, trying to recruit Central Asians. So ISIS-K's online ecosystem is producing dynamic propaganda and has been doing so for the last, I would say, 18 months, maybe 24 months, not longer. I mean, that's at least my visibility into it. And this propaganda has been persistent in the face of moderation, attempts at deplatforming. And look, I take propaganda seriously. jihadi propaganda seriously, in particular propaganda by ISIS-K, because time and again, ISIS-K propaganda messaging has correlated with operational reality. The timing, the content of the messaging, the focus of the messaging, I think has been indicative of operational intent, at times even active plans. So it's not just cheap talk, it's not just mere rhetoric. So that is fairly concerning. I don't understand why, say, for it has proven so challenging for the U.S. military to take out some of these propaganda platforms online. We can get into a discussion around that, because it's clear that some of this propaganda has made inroads into communities, has been able to draw, attract, recruits, maybe even radicalize people who are, Central Asians who are well beyond the borders of Central Asia, such as, migrant communities. Very quickly, in terms of some of the themes that I have picked up in the propaganda of ISIS-K that I've monitored, aimed at and disseminated in Central Asian languages like Tajiki, Uzbek. There are certainly attempts at direct recruitment. There are lots of specific calls to the youth in Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, even to migrate to Afghanistan. Those calls have been persistent. I mean, I'll give you an example, a very simple but illustrative quote from a Tajik-focused material: "Come to Khorasan, join ISIS-K training, and actively participate in the conflict." So these kinds of calls you find in some of the appeals that have been put out through this material. Lots of focus on biographies of, say, key Tajik fighters. So Abu Muhammad al-Tajiki, he's been portrayed as sort of this great Central Asian figure in the movement, who contributed to the cause. Another theme that has I think that has been really interesting and important, even troublesome, is the anti-government framing. So very detailed criticisms of Central Asian regimes, particularly the government of Tajikistan. Lots of discussion around religious restrictions in, say, places like Tajikistan. Portrayal of regional governments as puppets of either Russia or China. That's been another theme. And then direct threats as well, threats of violence. And finally, another sort of more ancillary but important theme that I've picked up is the focus on Russian diaspora, on the diaspora in Russia. Targeting of trying to speak to Central Asian migrants in Russia. Talk of discrimination of Central Asian workers. And the portrayal of the Moscow Crocus City Hall attack as a model operation. So those are some of the themes. I've painted a threat picture for you. So let me stop there, and then we can come back, pick up on some of the threads here, and then in the broader discussion as well.
Okay, thanks. Asfandyar, just a quick follow-up question. If we go back to from March 24, the Crocus City bombings to today, do you see that ISIS-K is more capable and that they are larger, the group is larger, Central Asians are being successfully recruited, contributing to enhanced capabilities?
Yeah.
What looks different today from 14 months ago?
Yeah.
15.
Yeah. So I think there it's the news is good. It seems like we've seen some successful counterterrorism action against ISIS-K. The Taliban have certainly sustained pressure against ISIS-K within the borders of Afghanistan. And then more recently, Pakistan has also taken various actions against ISIS-K, against ISIS-K presence on its side of the border. And we heard about that from the CENTCOM commander, General Kurilla, the recent hearing of the House Armed Services Committee, in which he mentioned that the Pakistanis had taken out several high-value targets, leaders. At the same time, it is unclear whether that pressure has been more directed against, say, Central Asian elements or some of the Pashtun elements within the organization. We don't have great visibility into who all has been targeted, but we're now hearing from multiple sources that much greater levels of pressure has been brought to bear on ISIS-K in the first 6 months of 2025 compared to much of 2024.
Okay, thank you. Some good news. Noah, let's expand the lens a bit, and I think you'll be talking a bit more about kind of global jihad at large and where this Central Asian piece fits.
So I want to talk to you about three things sort of quickly, and I really have an immense privilege of coming after these two previous speakers, Gavin and Asfandyar, who I just I'm really pleased to be here with and have had the privilege of working with for the last few years. So I want to be clear that nothing that I'm going to say is meant to contradict anything that they have said. We're not. I'm going to talk about some stuff that moves in a little bit different direction, but I'm building on the foundation of what they've said. In particular, Gavin, highlighting that these grievances that were so successfully messaged to and so successfully used to mobilize people, or that attracted people, both pushed and attracted people into the Syrian conflict in numbers that were really quite shocking, are still there. They're still being messaged to, and they're still being used, but in different ways, because the realities of these conflicts have changed, and then also the realities that the strategies that the groups are using have evolved, both in order to keep up with changes in the technology and to keep up with changes in the goals that they have. And I'm also going to say I'm really only going to talk about Uzbek-speaking non-ISIS groups today. Asfandyar did such a great job covering ISIS-K. The stuff that I'm going to talk about is sort of a contrast to that, because they're following quite different strategies and activating in different ways. But this is not to contradict anything that Asfandyar has said about ISIS-K. So what does this look like? We're in a new area of militant Islamism for Central Asians, in which they've evolved in these different realities. This is point one. And they've split now into sort of three groups that themselves have absorbed some of the former groups into them. So we have what I call the Taliban et al., since the Taliban took over Afghanistan. And here we see a lot of the smaller former groups, people that we used to call the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan or the Islamic Jihad Union. We have a fair number of fighters from the Abdullah Bukhari Brigade in Syria that left several years ago to join with the Taliban around the time that they were making their final offensives and eventually took Kabul. So we're referring to them as sort of this larger group that follows its own goals, but are generally coordinated by what the Taliban wants. And we'll talk about what that is here in a moment. Then the second large group here are what is now the former Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and now just the government of Syria. So this is a quite different situation. And as we'll talk about a little bit, there's a large contingent of Central Asians, Uzbeks and Tajiks in particular, who were part of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, divided into these different brigades and sub-brigades that had different names and different commanders. But really, what we learned in watching the offensive out of Idlib that eventually successfully toppled Assad in December of last year was that these guys are fighting really closely coordinated as a unit within the rest of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. They appeared to be very integrated, both in operations and especially in their messaging discipline. There's just no daylight between the things that were being said in Uzbek by these groups and the things that are being said on mainstream HTS channels and eventually Ahmed al-Shara's spokespeople in English on their Twitter and things like that. And then the third group, of course, are ISIS-K, who have changed a lot from original ISIS, but are what we would continue to call, as Asfandiar really well described, a traditional small-scale terrorist group. They're a militant insurgent underground group that continues to do the same kinds of things that these groups don't anymore because they're part of ruling coalitions in different ways, whereas ISIS-K, and in particular the Central Asians that are in it, a lot of them were a splinter off from the Taliban, so they spend a lot of their time focusing on that and external operations. Okay, so how has the messaging changed as their realities have changed in each of these three groups? I'm not so much going to cover ISIS-K because Asfandiar did such a great job, but the Taliban groups, what does this look like? So Taliban-associated messaging, I'll show you a little bit of it here, but it looks a lot like this picture here on the left. A great deal of it is meant to show the Taliban as a victorious, modern, highly organized force, always, using essentially looted ISAF equipment and things like that and putting it to different uses, as we'll see in a couple of slides. But, they really, a lot of their messaging focuses on portraying themselves in kind of a Hollywood movie style as a modern, super technological force governing a legitimate state, as they would argue, although they'll use, here, this is captioned over a famous quote from Abdullah Azam. So they haven't forsaken their jihadist roots, but they really are concentrating on portraying themselves as a legitimate state. And so the groups within that have been pulled in, at least the ones that used to message in Uzbek, no longer really meaningfully maintain their own brands. Now, I'm sure that as soon as I say this, somebody's going to be able to go out there and find a Telegram account that still says I am you or something like that. There are still some that say Jamaat Ansarullah. But by and large, the larger messaging operations that we were following through this time have been merged into things that have become, I used to call it violent extremist adjacent. I like now, I'm trying to try out a new term, and you can all let me know how this works. Alt jihad, in the same way that the far right and neo-Nazi groups and things like that split into this other version that we're all very familiar with now within our own politics and in European politics, the alt-right, who have become now major mainstream players within a large number of states. We're not going to talk about the United States here, but if we look at Germany, if we look at the UK, if we look at France, if we look at Sweden, we have lots of places where groups that were previously outside the Overton window of politics 20 years ago have now successfully, in some ways, moderated and adapted their approaches to mainstream media and succeeded in shifting the Overton window so that they can be included in mainstream politics. And I'm not positive that this is exactly what groups like those supporting the Taliban are looking for in Central Asia. It's not clear that they're forming political parties or that they want to participate in mainstream politics as it is, but they want to participate in the mainstream political discourse. And so they've changed a lot of the ways that they're portraying these things. And the Taliban focus groups portray the Taliban as a Central Asian indigenous alternative to what they say is the moral corruption of the West, the literal corruption at home, and then Putin's warmongering. Just some basic examples of what this looks like. They're calling for emulation in Central Asia, not necessarily saying that the Taliban are going to spread, that they're going to cross the borders, but that Central Asians themselves, Uzbeks in southern Kyrgyzstan, Uzbeks in Uzbekistan, should be setting up, sort of similar movements without being prescriptive and without specifically calling to violence. So they're portraying the Taliban as this competent force that keeps security, that has far lower crime rates, for example, than what we see inside Uzbekistan, where corruption is punished, where drug addiction is treated, narcotic sales are punished, this sort of things, where they're paving roads. And where, like, here's a great example from last year, at the same time that countries across Central Asia were experiencing floods that the governments did not handle very well, Taliban messaging was all over this, showing them rescuing stranded villagers who could have drowned in the floods with looted ISAF equipment with the Taliban flag stuck on it and graffiti to boot. So this is the type of messaging that we're seeing. Next to that, or alongside that, are what we might call sort of alt-jihad influencers, like the former Al-Qaeda and ISIS-aligned imams from Dagestan, like Abdullah Kastesi, who is a very popular and influential figure in Russian language Salafi movements, in particular, including in Kazakhstan, and Abdullah Zafar, who was previously the most important ISIS recruiter in the Uzbek language, who now has denounced ISIS and supports the Taliban and claims that he no longer supports jihad, but continues to support the same kind of Islamic values in society, lived out in your everyday life, pushing the politics, pushing open that Overton window and acceptance, while staying within the terms of service for YouTube, Instagram, and other major platforms, so that he doesn't get kicked out and reaches vastly larger platforms, reaches a vastly larger audience than he did when he was openly recruiting for ISIS. And these guys argue, again, that the Taliban are this sort of fourth alternative. Within the groups that used to be part of HTS, whatever we're going to call them here, we see these alternative figures, a lot of them including people who style themselves as video bloggers, like this guy that I've been following for a number of years, who doesn't portray himself as a militant himself, but as sort of a Vice-style action news reporter embedded with the groups fighting from Idlib and down. He released actually kind of an incredible video in December, one of the first people inside the dreaded Sidnaya prison right after it was liberated, interviewing families, interviewing the victims of just awful human atrocities in this prison that goes down many, many floors into the ground, and compares it at the same time to the Jaslik prison in Uzbekistan under Karimov. So they've not entirely forgotten about the Central Asian context, but portraying themselves as pro-democratic, really liberators who are effective against authoritarians in the way that ordinary liberal democratic forces are not. And then we have them doing a lot of stuff, in particular in the months that they were waiting in Idlib before the attacks. They started drawing these really large followings as kind of manosphere influencers, but in an Islamic vein, where they're showing young men how to use all kinds of different weapons. It's generally ideology free. It attracts very large audiences in the same ways that the manosphere influencers do MMA fighters and things like that. And different as these guys are real militants who know how to use weapons and know how to fight in intense urban combat. They make a lot of references to Hollywood films and things like that, but show what this is really like in real life, and are talking about how a man can act and what a man can do, and when a man should use violence in order to defend his family and defend his homeland. And so taking these things all together, and I'll stop at this, in particular, as I've looked recently, working on some other projects for the UK Home Office and things like that, about how external influences can help lead ordinary protest moments to become violent. I'm really interested in the way that this kind of alt-jihad and the parallels that we see on the alt-right may prompt us to look for something different than what terrorism writ large looked like before. In the same way that far-right extremism erupts in things like the Southport riots in the UK last summer, with this incredible, impossible to map and follow mix of influencers from all of these different areas, united by a general reactionary posture and illiberalism and sort of manosphere and misinformation ideas. When we combine these things together with opportunistic influencers from illiberal political and social entrepreneurs. I think in a moment in which Central Asia undergoes any kind of instability or moments of protests, like what happened in Kazakhstan a couple of years ago, what happened in Uzbekistan, what has happened in Tajikistan repeatedly at different times. I'm afraid that as this ecosphere continues to grow, we may see it move in different directions than we would have anticipated in the past. So thank you for your time, and I will stop there and stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Noah. That was really fascinating. And just a quick kind of follow-up question. I'm especially interested in the well, the whole notion of alt-jihad, but particularly in the context of the Taliban. On the one hand, the Taliban, is a nation state, and they have nation state relations with, in particular, with the Central Asian states, particularly Uzbekistan, but not only. But then there's this other wing, so to speak. It kind of reminds me of the Soviets in the 1930s with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Comintern. A more ideological wing that is trying to promote or play upon existing grievances of the type that Gavin was discussing in his opening remarks. And it would seem to be a quite fine line that the Taliban needs to follow there.
Yeah, I think that's a really perceptive comment and a good comparison, in many ways. And I think that another level to that comparison is that just like in the 1930s, there were a number of people in the United States and in Europe who sort of bought the line that was fed by the Communist International and were, denying Stalin's atrocities and Ukrainian famine and things like this that were happening. There was so little access to reliable information, reliable objective information about what was actually happening within there. Despite all the technological advances and other forms of media that we have, we don't see a lot of evidence that there is much alternative or objective news coverage that reaches Central Asian societies in Central Asian languages about what's happening inside of Afghanistan, other than what's produced by the Taliban and its allies. And that is a real similarity that we see to the early years of the Syrian conflict, and one that I think really played an important role in helping to recruit, because people really had no idea what they were getting themselves into. And I think for a lot of Central Asians who might like what they see in this sort of Taliban propaganda, the very externalized version of what this might look like, I think there are a lot of surprises waiting compared to what life is actually like inside an Afghanistan run by the Taliban.
Let me pose one more question to the group. And how has the financing? What is the financing picture for? Does this look like, and how is that changing, if it is at all?
Well, one thing I would say is that all of the grievances that I talked about are grievances that, we're talking about being expressed as people getting on a plane or a train and going to fight in a jihad. We've seen even a broader range of issues around which people are willing to make financial contributions. So, Central Asians didn't pick up and move to Gaza when that war started, but we did see a lot of the Islamist brosphere that Noah was talking about, trying to financially support themselves by offering halal assistance to Palestinian relief or whatever. So they're doing fundraising things. So all of those, there are different levels of exposure and response to all of the drivers that we talked about, some of those certainly are going to be financial.
Asfandyar, how is ISIS-K financing itself?
Sure. Yeah, it's I think we have some visibility into that through some of the disclosures by U.S. Department of Treasury. They've used regular black market fundraising via Hundi Hawala. They raise money overseas, then they move it through these human smugglers or through black market channels. There've been people have been reported to moving money from, say, places like Turkey towards Afghanistan. We've definitely heard about that. The other and more troubling trend has been the use of crypto, and ISIS-K has been seeking donations via crypto, and they have used
On the dark web or more straight?
well, it's mixed. So one platform that comes up is Monero, and the use of Monero. Binance is also another sort of possibility that maybe that has been leveraged. The fact that crypto prices have gone up by quite a lot. Bitcoin is trading over 100,000 right now, as we speak, and market speculation here is that it is on track to maybe go up to by the end of the year to 150K or so. So if they have been holding on to crypto, then they have actually been making a lot of money. Just, it's a good saving, it's a good investment in that sense. So I worry about that. But it's unclear where they may be able to monetize, convert that into actual cash. I'm sure there's a pretty vast black market out there, and there are people who specialize in that. So yeah, let me stop there.
So let's go to a question we have. We have a couple of questions from Almakan Arozabekova. The first question is, here in Central Asia, we oftentimes mention the threat of Central Asian fighters based in Afghanistan, including those who possibly came from Syria, Iraq. However, when it comes to real assessment of the threat, it is very difficult to refer to any reliable data. Do you know, or could you refer to any data source on, for example, how many CA fighters there are based in Afghanistan? What is their operational capacity, and their interaction with any violent extremist groups, including ISIS-K and excluding Taliban? Do you think, is there a scenario that they could threaten, attack Central Asia? And the second question I'll put out there as well for all of you: more than 1,000 people, mostly men, mostly women and children, were repatriated to Central Asian countries, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. What is your assessment, if you are aware, of the ongoing rehabilitation and reintegration programs, and especially of the challenges? I think Gavin said something about that in his opening remarks, but let me turn to you. Who wants to the data question in particular?
I can come in on that, and the answer is actually might be disappointing. We don't know how many Central Asians are actually there, and it's remains very hard to estimate. The UN monitoring team for the 1267 Sanctions Committee and the Taliban Sanctions Committee, I mean, they try to get at numbers. They ask regional governments as well. Regional governments provide certain estimates. But those numbers are they're never well reasoned. It's unclear, how those numbers are actually assessed. But I will say that I think in the last 3 to 4 years, we underestimated the numbers or the level of participation, involvement of Central Asian fighters, both in the region, in AFPAC, as well as overseas operatives who were in touch with with ISIS-K. So all to say, whatever number we think may be the case, the actual number is probably higher than that. In terms of the potential for attacks from this region into Central Asia, certainly there are threats to that effect in the propaganda. But we have not seen very many attacks, at least not of the scale type that we've seen inside Afghanistan. So that leads me to wonder that maybe there is some prohibitive factor. Either it is state capacity in Central Asia, due to which these groups remain unable to penetrate Central Asian defenses. But I defer to Gavin and Noah on that. I'll stop here.
Thanks, Asfandyar. Gavin, Noah, either want to jump in?
I'll very quickly speak to the returnee issue, which we've done a lot of work on. I know Noah has done a lot of work on as well, with us and with others. I think part of the problem is, number one, the countries in the region sort of wanted this reintegration to be short term. So we've had a lot of sort of like, mission accomplished thinking on the part of the countries that, have been really, like, especially Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan have been dealing with this reintegration process since before COVID. So that's actually, I have a paper shredder that just went off for some reason. That's scary. They have sort of felt as if the reintegration process is one and done. They haven't seen this as long a term a problem about trauma and social work maybe as we would have thought. And then there was, I would say, a palpable chill when, especially after Crocus City Hall, when there was a fear that maybe the problem set of foreign fighters and extremism was becoming more of a thing, to really sort of think less about reintegration and more about suppression, more about control. So I think we all collectively felt a more difficult time trying to engage as Westerners on these issues of reintegration as that happened. And then, I think I certainly have a sense that while this was largely in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan a successful reintegration overall, that not all of the returnees are availing themselves of the resources the state has made available. Not all of them have reintegrated. Some of them have sort of returned to the communities that they came from before radicalization, because those were easy places to go to, where they weren't feeling as much stigma. So I would say, it's a combination of trying to think of this as a shorter term problem than it probably is, and the efforts at reintegration really being dependent on how the countries in the region are feeling about the overall Islamist situation.
Thanks. Noah, do you want to jump in?
I'll jump in on that one. And Al-Nahan, thank you for being here today, and thanks for the question. I've gotten to see you for a little while, so happy to see you here. I think the most important thing to say about the returnee issue is that this remains a remarkably positive story overall, and one where the Central Asian states are just out miles ahead of many of the European states and of a lot of their other counterparts. They really have they've really been very far forward in this. It's a really positive policy. It's been adaptable in most of the countries. Most of the countries have shown willingness to learn from early mistakes or from things that they didn't think of. You're not going to be able to think of everything. As they encountered needs, they adapted to them. So I want to emphasize that this is a really positive story, and that for as far as we can tell, a lot of the returnees after a couple of years of support that they've gotten, that's going to be all that they need. They are going to go on and live positive, healthy, peaceful lives as citizens and as people whose lives were saved really by their governments bringing them back in this way. We're at a real watershed though now, as Gavin said, where interest in them has really waned. They've gone really far down on the list of priorities, both for local governments and for international governments, or for international governments in particular, including some of the larger former supporters. There are all of these incentives that work together for both international donors and for local governments to say, this was fantastic, we did a great job, and now we're done. And for a lot of people, that is the case. But for a lot of others, and we don't know entirely how many or what percent in each country, which is one of the big things that's missing from this still. We just don't know how many of them are going to need much longer term support, where they can't just be treated like everybody else, because their experiences or the injuries that they sustained are in some cases, were really very serious and still require medical attention. Not just ordinary physical injuries, but then also trauma as well that continues to be really there's just not a capacity to serve it for them or for their neighbors who have also gone through lots of deeply traumatizing things. Just to get a small window into what that looks like in Kazakhstan, for the US State Department supported program that was run by Steve Wine and Heidi Ellis and a large other team of us that worked on it, we were able to do the most comprehensive assessment and survey of a large proportion of the returnee adults. We were able to use standardized health screeners, in particular for mental health, and we found that while about half of them reported no kind of psychological distress in the longer term, half of them did, is the other corollary to that. And about 15% of that total would likely qualify for a disorder that's going to genuinely make it hard for them to live their everyday life in a full way, whether that's major depression or post-traumatic stress disorder or something along those lines. And we probably need to assume that the children are in the same kind of line, but we don't know. We just don't know, and that's a huge thing to do.
Okay, excellent. Excellent response, and interesting to that it's a rather positive story. Okay, it's just about time to close, but I want to add a couple of questions from our audience and give you guys a last round of comments. Hugh Sadri, which Central Asian state seems to be most in danger by these radical groups? Why? And from William Veal, what about camps in Syria? And Noah, there have been a couple of requests for your PowerPoint presentation to be available. If you are willing to, we would be delighted to post that on the center site along with the video of our conversation if you're up for that. Okay. So what about camps in Syria, and which Central Asian state seems to be in most danger by these radical groups, and why? Okay, Gavin, why don't we go with you? The first question seems most addressed to you.
So the camps in Syria, I think it varies by country. The Kazakhs have been saying for quite a while that they've gotten all of their people out, except a very small number who don't want to come back. I think there's probably still substantial numbers from Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan who started later in the process. Uzbekistan seems to have done a really good job at getting their people out. So, as far as Noah mentioned that a lot of other countries, including the United States, have been less aggressive about getting people out of the especially Al-Hol. That being said, on the second question, I think, and specifically in relation to ISKP, we've seen enough of a connection to Tajikistan to see that there
Yeah.
are clearly Tajiks involved in the recruitment process somehow. Again, goes back to those networks that I was talking about. Some Uzbeks, but it seems that Tajikistan is really the country where they're getting the most traction either through networks or through messaging. And it's also a country that is, perhaps more vulnerable than the others, on the scale of vulnerable to not vulnerable.
Thanks. Yeah, I agree. Asfandyar, any final comments?
Yeah, just would foot stomp what Gavin said, that the involvement of Tajiks in ISIS-K is definitely striking, notable. The ability of ISIS-K to recruit or radicalize these lone wolves in these migrant communities, that is also very notable. So I don't want to overstate the case here, but I wonder if that is where ISIS-K has the most capability, and it could leverage some of that capability against Tajikistan in particular. But again, we have not seen any notable incident inside Tajikistan for now.
Let me just follow on question to that, which I shouldn't do at this point, but I'm going to do anyway. Do you think that how active is ISIS-K in recruiting Tajiks in particular in Russia, the Tajik guest workers there? Very, very.
That is borne out of the propaganda that they've been putting out, as well as then reports of the involvement of or people who have actually tried to do things on behalf of ISIS-K.
Plus, Andy, I mean, it's important to remember that if you can get 2 or 3 or 4 labor migrants to grab AK-47s and shoot something up or throw gas bombs at something, that's a pretty cheap, ante for getting something done. So there's this worry about being able to, virtually create something from recruits who maybe aren't, skilled and well trained in the ways of, terrorist methodology.
So an event like a Crocus City, that's got to be very good for recruiting as well as raising funds.
And it's relatively low effort.
Yeah. Okay, Noah, last word.
I'll just echo everything that's been said. My money's also on Tajikistan, and I'm concerned about, in particular, like Asfandyar mentioned, I think there's a potential for sort of inspired lone wolf attacks that's being cultivated, across each of the countries, but Tajikistan certainly one where that's particularly being cultivated. But I'm really concerned also about just overall stability for Tajikistan. It feels of all the countries in the region, it feels like the one that is getting closer to its breaking point. But we've been saying that for years, and it hasn't yet. So yeah, it's hard to be in the prediction business here.
Okay. Noah, Asfandyar, and Gavin, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts with us today about this fascinating and moving target of analysis and discussion. We managed to get through 60+ minutes without mentioning the 4-letter word Iran. But to our listeners, I think that is going to be what's happening in Iran is going to be the next topic for one of our online events of the Central Asian Connectivity Project. So thanks to our speakers and thanks to our audience, and may all of you, wherever you are, stay cool. It's going to be 109 down here in Williamsburg today. At least that's how it's supposed to feel. All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Andy.
Thank you.